Well, I said yesterday that Valtteri Bottas was in very good shape to win the Turkish Grand Prix, providing nothing went wrong and he played the variables well. And so it proved he was in the best car and he maximised the best car from the pole that he'd inherited from Lewis Hamilton, who had to start P11. And right at the end, in the last 2 laps of the race, Valtteri did 2 purple laps. His last lap, when he had the race won, he didn't need to take any risks at all, but nonetheless, he was enjoying himself so much. 30.4 fastest laps, like 2 seconds quicker than anybody else went all day. So don't let anybody tell you this wasn't a dominating win for Valtteri Bottas. This was. That showed how much pace he had in hand and how confident he was in that car. As I say, the Mercedes, a really good car around Turkey all weekend, in the dry and in the wet. And Lewis Hamilton showed that as well from his P11 start. Yeah, a lot of things could have gone wrong for him. He could have got involved in some sort of first corner schmozzle. He kept his nose clean there. He lost quite a lot of early time behind Yuki Tsunoda, who was enjoying, I'm sure, his P9 starting position and leading the 7 times world champion and doing a pretty good job, not really making any mistakes. But it was interesting seeing those two because Yuki was just doing what you'd expect him to do, just driving absolutely on the racing line, the geometrical racing line. And, doing a good job, not really locking up under brakes and doing things correctly. But you could see Lewis behind him just using all sorts of bits of road that Yuki wasn't even thinking of going near, trying the outside, trying the inside, doing this, just filling his mirrors, but also feeling where the grip was. And then suddenly, zap, Lewis got him on the outside of, I think it was turn 3, one of the tight corners before the plunge downhill. And that wasn't just a gap there that Lewis went. That was Lewis knowing what the grip level was on the outside because he'd been playing with the grip level there on the previous laps. And that was, I wonder whether Tsunoda would have thought, yeah, that was a very smart move by Lewis. And, I need to put that in the memory bank for next time. Probably not, but, that was a really, really nice move by Lewis, I thought. And then later in the race, having passed a few more cars, Lewis found himself about 6 seconds behind Sergio Perez in the other Red Bull Honda, and he'd been going pretty well. As I said yesterday, he's looked pretty good all weekend, and he's good at Turkey, always has been good at Turkey, in Turkey. And it was interesting then, because Lewis's tyres were starting to overheat, and it was a moment when he had free track, so you could see he backed away, and his lap times fell away by about a second, but they fell away into this incredibly consistent groove. So although he was going a bit slower, looking after the tyres, he was still remorselessly catching Perez. It was a really nice bit of Lewis's race as well, I thought. And then when, of course, the tyres got their grip back again, he just went for it, set fastest lap, and all of a sudden he's on Perez. And he caught Sergio. And then, it was a really interesting section of Sector 3, Lewis is past Sergio, basically, but Sergio's still on the inside going into the hairpin and holds position. And I've got to say here, and I've been saying this for years and years and years, ever since in his first season in Formula One, Max got stuck behind Sergio Perez in the Mexican Grand Prix when Sergio was driving for Force India and just couldn't get past him. And I was thinking, I made a note then, this guy Perez, when he gets in a groove, his defence is unbelievably good. And I've made that point a few times. And he was driving beautifully in defence with Lewis. His lap times were dropping by about a second and a half in doing what he had to do. But he was just using all the road. And they came round the hairpin, side by side, into the next right, side by side. Lewis tried to edge him, but didn't do it too much, then went back to the outside. And then they went down out of the last corner, side by side. And Sergio still held position going into turn 1. Really nice bit of driving by both of them. Very clean, but, that's what we want from Formula One. It was just really good. I was thinking then, I wonder if Max was in that car, if it would have ended up the same way. It probably would, I think, because it was all slow speed stuff. Very like the Max Lewis stuff on the slow speed corners we saw at Silverstone in the British Grand Prix on that opening lap. So yeah, that was a nice bit of the race, but then it kind of all changed, and it's a bit confusing. But I might as well continue the chronology because the Lewis story versus the Sergio Perez story defined the second half of the race. And from Lewis's point of view, he was picking up positions, and he felt that even when the intermediates were wearing out, there was an upside in that. One, they might become slicks and the track might dry out a little bit more. But secondly, even if they didn't, the car was sliding around, but he was kind of enjoying himself and obviously using his own ability to stay with it and do a great job on a car that's sliding around. So Lewis didn't want to stop, quite clearly, because he was picking up positions every time a Charles Leclerc or a Sergio Perez came in. But in the end, he did have to stop. And this was the sting in the tail of this Grand Prix, if you like, because when a driver chose to stop, or when he was brought in eventually for his second set of intermediates, kind of defined how he was going to perform thereafter. Because it took, we now know, nobody knew this going into the race, and nobody really knew this yesterday when they were running in FP3 in the wet, and I'll get onto that in a second, why they didn't. But nobody really knew that it was going to take 5 laps for the next set of intermediates, set 2, to get up to operating temperature, mode, grip level, whatever you want to call it. And as a result of that, and as a result of Charles Leclerc staying out for as long as he could, like Lewis, wow, I could maybe win this race. He was leading it for a while when Valtteri and Max came in. Can I hang on? Can I hang on? What's the worst I can hear? And you're getting quite excited for Charles and Ferrari. He'd driven beautifully all day. And but when he did come in, it was too late, because in his 5-lap period, when he was trying to get the tyres up to temperature and the car was just sliding all over the place, Sergio Perez had got his temperature out there, and it was just all over him. It was an easy pass for him at the end of the straight. And it was similarly a situation with Lewis, because when Lewis came out, he was saying, look, I told you I shouldn't have stopped. I've got absolutely no grip. The car's sliding all over the place now. The tyres are graining. And he was actually vulnerable at that point to Pierre Gasly passing, who'd started at exactly the right moment as well. Had a really nice balance and grip level on the AlphaTauri Honda, albeit with a 5-second penalty. We'll get onto that in a minute, for a first corner skirmish with Fernando Alonso. But after a while, Lewis got the grip. This is probably the end of the race now, and he got the grip and he was back doing his lap times again. But that 5-lap hiatus of the new set of intermediates finding its level defined really that third place for Sergio Perez, because he had the perfect set of intermediates. Great call by Red Bull to bring him in when they did. The odd thing here, and this is the really odd thing, is that Max Verstappen also came in for his second set of intermediates within a lap of Sergio. But on that second set, he was completely out of it. He never had any confidence in the car. It was sliding much more than the Perez Red Bull, and he just lost ground massively to Valtteri. He was within 2 to 3 seconds on that first run from the grid right up to the pit stops. But with the second set, he was losing half a second a lap to Valtteri and never got that rhythm back again. And there was a bit of talk after the race about, you've got to be pretty happy with that. Max, P2, taking the lead in the World Championship, still a long way to go. A lot of points out there with the point scoring system they have. So it's a completely irrelevant situation, I think, that at the moment, Max versus Lewis. But there's no way Max Verstappen would have been happy after that race, because that's a race he should have won, and he would be thinking, what's going on? I'm at least as good as Valtteri in the wet, if not better, and yet we got blown away in the second phase of the race. And of course there will be something wrong with Max's car or the set of tyres, because for Sergio Perez to be that much quicker and that much more confident on the second set compared with Max suggests that there is a major issue, or there was a major issue on Max's car. So he won't be happy with that. Of course, you're happy when you finish a wet race and you haven't had any of the dramas that can come with it, I suppose. P2, P3 for Red Bull, Honda. This was normally, in the way the season's been going, you would think, 1-2 for Red Bull, Valtteri Bottas, P3. So let's get back to Valtteri, because everyone will be saying, wow, it's about time he got his act together. Where have you been, Valtteri? I think, the interesting thing now is that almost certainly, deep down inside, and he will never say it, almost certainly Toto Wolff is thinking, we should have kept him. This is very annoying for Valtteri to win this race the way he did, because Toto's a Valtteri guy. He really is. I mean, without Toto, Valtteri probably wouldn't even be in Formula One. And he drove a Valtteri race that we've seen many times, 2019, 2020. And all I can say is that he was in that position to drive the race he did. And once you've got the pole in a race like that, and you've got a well-balanced car, it can kind of happen for you. As we saw, of course, with Esteban Ocon in Hungary. If things fall your way, you can win a race. And Valtteri did that, and he did it really well. But he got the pole, the effective pole, I keep making the point, because the Pirelli sidewall is now favouring the Mercedes more than it's favouring, if you like, Red Bull. And I don't believe that on the same Pirellis that we started the year, with which we started the year, I don't believe Valtteri would have been on the pole in Turkey. So I think that's where it goes back to. And that's when you say, oh, well, Valtteri, where have you been? Well, I can tell you where he's been. He's been struggling on the grip level and balance of the Mercedes with the less rigid rear sidewalls of the Pirelli. And they've made a massive difference. And now he's got a car that got him the pole in the dry and allowed him to win, therefore, in the wet, albeit in a brilliant car with a great balance and a great grip level. The problem Valtteri's had, and the reason he's being replaced by George Russell, is because when the car was very difficult to drive, as it was in the first half of this year, with the less rigid rear sidewalls, he wasn't as good as Lewis at adapting to that. And I've gone into that ad nauseum, I think, probably in a lot of videos, as to how Lewis's driving is very different from Valtteri's. And you know, that was it. P4 Charles Leclerc drove well. I mean, frustrated, obviously, that the car was so bad when he got onto that second set of intermediates. But he did find his pace in the last 3 or 4 laps. He was able to pull away from Lewis and consolidate P4. So I think you've got to say that if both Charles and Lewis eventually came in, probably it was the right call for the team. And both of them, though, will be thinking, maybe if we'd stayed out, it would have been slightly different. I mean, Charles wouldn't have won it. Obviously, he got passed on the road by Bottas again. But he might have been third. He might have been. Unlikely, but he might have been. Very closely behind Lewis at the end, although Lewis was able to pull away in the last couple of laps. Pierre Gasly, Lando Norris, and then catching that group very quickly, Carlos Sainz, who drove really well from the back of the grid. Classic Carlos Sainz situation, wet. He's very good on tyre calls. Got to say, we've seen that now in a couple of races. He's very good on knowing when to be on the intermediates and when not. So he did all that right again, came in at the right moment, relatively early, and did a really good job from the back of the grid, passing people. As I say, classic Carlos Sainz situation, because not a lot to lose, lots to gain. He didn't do anything crazy, but he sized his way through the traffic. The most amusing thing, I thought, was when he caught Sebastian Vettel in the Aston Martin, who had another really messy day, and at one point went out on slick mediums. I don't know what he was thinking of, sliding all over the place. Actually, a mobile chicane for a lap when he came back into the pits. But before that, Carlos Sainz had basically got inside, easy pass, inside Sebastian Vettel. And then I don't know what, well, I know what was going on. Sebastian was sort of out here, Carlos was here, no problem at all. And at the last minute, Sebastian sort of came across and they touched, and Carlos thought, what's that all about? And just kept going, as he would. And then Vettel got on the radio saying, he drove straight into me. Well, of course, he didn't drive straight into him. He was actually in the corner, and Sebastian came over on him. And then I realised what was going on. None of these drivers, Ocon, Sainz, had made allowance for Sebastian being this incredible V driver that he is, particularly when it's semi-wet or wet. And what Sebastian was doing was braking late, as he always does, mega late braker, in a straight line, V'ing the corner, slow rotation mid-corner, and then coming back from a very wide point back to the exit again, straight line exit. This is what he always does. So from Sebastian's point of view, he was just driving normally and sort of doing one of these, and then he was going to do one of those. And when he came to do one of those, he drove straight into Carlos Sainz. And the same thing was going on with Ocon. Ocon had no idea what Sebastian was doing, but that's what Sebastian always does. And when you hear all these messages coming out from the pit wall, from engineers to drivers about this and this, whether it's to do with the yellow flags, whether it's to do with blue flags, what the distance you should be, 1.2 seconds if you're going to get a blue flag for the guy in front, all the other stuff that they talk about, it's wet on line here, watch the curb there. What they never say is, you're coming up to Sebastian Vettel now. Remember, this guy's a mega V driver, and he's going to be incredibly wide mid-corner before he swings back in front of you. Why don't they do that? Because it's so clear that is the way Sebastian drives. And there's lots of other styles out there that the engineers should be talking about. I know the answer. They don't actually watch out on the track, and they don't actually notice what's going on. And that's amazing to me, really, because how a driver, everybody's different. Every racing driver on the grid has a slightly different style. Some of them are a completely different style, Sebastian Vettel being a good example. But the engineers never, ever take that into account. I don't know why. Well, they just assume all the drivers are the same. I think they all brake here, they all turn in there, they all put the power on there, they all do this, they all do that. And it's just a given that they're all the same. Yes, because the simulator tells them that. Yeah, I won't go down that path anymore. So let's look at the other results. Very close group there. Pierre Gasly, Lando Norris, Carlos Sainz. Lando did a good job, as I said he would. He just went round and round in a car that wasn't very good, very easy to drive. No mistakes, finished P7, got some points in a race where the McLaren Mercedes was not an easy car to drive. Lance Stroll went round, finished 9th. A bit disappointing really, because he is pretty good in the wet. You'd imagine, what is going on in Aston Martin? But Lance Stroll can only finish 9th in Turkey. That's what I would say there. Esteban Ocon went round, finished 10th. Fairly, eventful race for him, particularly with all that stuff with Sebastian Vettel. And the Alfa Romeos, I sort of said, where were they yesterday? Well, they were 11th and 12th today. Not too bad, did a pretty good job. And Daniel Ricciardo, who started from the back of the grid as well, as it turned out, because he was so slow in qualifying, they thought they might as well go for an engine change. So they put him to the back of the grid, didn't affect his race at all. But he did stop quite early for a second set of intermediates, and they said to him, do you think you'll be quicker on a new set, Daniel? Quite early in the race, he said, oh yeah, brought him in. He was unbelievably slow until they got some grip at the end. Anyway, he finished 13th. Sonoda 14th. He eventually went off a really, I've got to say, a bit of a pathetic lose in turn 9 down the hill after turn 8. Just got sideways and all tangled up and didn't look very elegant in that position, P14. George Russell 15th, bit of a disappointment there really, only because we expect George in those conditions to be sort of, running P4, P5, if not for a while, but I totally get it. There wasn't a lot you could do if you were at the back of the grid, you were trapped in traffic, you didn't have a lot of grip, the car didn't feel great. Nicholas Latifi spun, I think, on the first lap. There was not a lot of feel from the Williams. It wasn't a great car in those conditions. And then we come to Fernando Alonso, who, of all the drivers out there, who, a bit like Valtteri, needed a result, a great result, in conditions that should have favoured him. It all ended at the first corner. He was on the outside going into turn 1 from his position, made a pretty good start. Pierre Gasly was in the middle of the road and using too much of the middle of the road, moving towards the right, leaving a big gap for Sergio Perez. And obviously Gasly was aware of that and was no way he was going to come across to the left because he was going to hit Perez. And so he basically ran a little bit wide and tapped Fernando. I guess you could say, if you're going to be on the outside, turn 1, Turkey in the wet, you're running a risk of somebody doing exactly what Pierre Gasly did to Fernando. But they gave Pierre a fine for that. He said, I was sandwiched between the two cars, which is what Nigel Mansell said at the 84 Detroit Grand Prix when Prost and Piquet sandwiched him off the line. He was a sort of innocent bystander in the middle, and there was a shunt. And afterwards, Bernie Ecclestone wanted Nigel to be banned for a year and fined $100,000 from memory. I think he got a $10,000 fine in the end. So, Pierre, be careful what you say about being sandwiched. Bernie Ecclestone, Detroit 84. That was never going to happen. But I will say this, and I've said it before, I'm not saying that Jackie Stewart is right about everything. And I know a lot of people will say, well, what is the relevance? But Jackie makes a very good point about preparation for the first corner of a Grand Prix, which is that you want to be absolutely neutral in everything so that your body is 100% reactive to everything that's going to happen around it, and everything is instinctive. That's all you can do. You can't plan anything. I know Lewis was saying, shall I go on the inside or the outside at the first corner? But, Lewis, believe me, would have just been in there reacting instinctively. And to do that, Jackie always tried to drain himself of emotion, of thought, and to be as calm as possible he got in the car. A complete counterpoint to doing reflex tests just before you get in the car, which does nothing other than heighten the senses in the brain and start the adrenaline pumping and the pulse rate. And we need to look at it more carefully, but Pierre Gasly does get involved in his fair share of first corner incidents. He will say very few of them are his fault, and it's always a result of qualifying where he does and being in the middle of that high midfield shunt. But he's not in a position often to predict what's going to happen and get away from it. And same thing today. And I wonder, I'd just be really interested to see Pierre's record over the remaining races if he didn't do all this stuff with the balls in the air, the juggling, etc., the reflex tests with the trainer just before he gets in the car. Do nothing at all, get in the car and just see what his record is like. going into first corners in this last phase of the race. It'd be an interesting test, wouldn't it? Won't happen, of course, because drivers do what they do and they think that they've got the right solution on everything. Which actually takes me back to Valtteri Bottas, because I think I should make another point about Valtteri, which was that when he was in his Williams days and early Mercedes days, he was very conscientious about being self-critical and learning and improving on areas that were not working as well as the other driver in the other car. And then recently, over the last 5 years, he hasn't been doing that. He's been working on a lot of other things, for sure. He's been working in the simulator, he's been doing this, he's been doing that, fitness, whatever. But what he hasn't been doing is working on things like the rate at which he comes out of the brake pedal pressure, how he comes out of the brake pedal pressure, how he loads up the steering, when he brakes, how does he create a lovely square area to have the car sitting on the road before a change of direction. All those little things that Lewis does so well, none of which you can learn on a simulator. And he hasn't been doing that. And I think that's also another reason that when the Mercedes hasn't been great before the change of the rear sidewalls, he was struggling against Lewis and as a result has lost his drive. And he will be thinking now, yeah, I've shown them, I'm as good as anybody in the world. I've won in difficult conditions, blitzed the race. But then he'll be thinking, but I've lost the drive. Not a great feeling. And, of course he'll be positive and he'll be thinking Alfa Romeo next year, we'll turn the team around, it'll be great working with Ferrari, great brand, and, I can be number one, all the things that he would be thinking. But it's a shame, actually, isn't it? When you see how well he drove today for Mercedes, and the job he did, absolutely perfect job, because without him it would have been a 1-2 for Red Bull on a weekend when Lewis obviously had that problem, the grid penalty. It's a shame that he isn't staying with Mercedes, you could argue, because as Lewis has been saying all along, he is kind of the perfect teammate. Anyway, it'll be George Russell next year, and that's a completely different deal, as I touched upon yesterday, but we'll touch upon it a lot more over the winter. Thanks for watching and subscribing. See you again soon.